When people hear the word empath, they often imagine someone who is endlessly kind, endlessly patient, and almost incapable of anger. They picture a person who naturally gives, forgives, and understands, but that image is incomplete. It ignores the hidden cost of living with such heightened emotional sensitivity. An empath is not simply someone who feels more. An empath is someone who often carries more than was ever theirs to carry. Think about what happens when a person spends years walking into every room, unconsciously measuring the emotional temperature. They notice the tension before anyone speaks, they sense disappointment hidden behind a smile, they recognize loneliness in people who insist they're fine. This ability can create remarkable compassion, but it also creates an invisible responsibility. Many empaths quietly become emotional caretakers. They begin believing that if someone is hurting, they should help. If someone is angry, they should calm them. If someone is disappointed, they must have done something wrong. Over time, this becomes more than kindness. It becomes an identity. Psychology teaches us that identity is reinforced by repetition. The behaviors we repeat become the stories we tell ourselves. If an empath spends years solving other people's emotional problems, they eventually stop asking a much more important question: who is taking care of me? Their own needs slowly become negotiable, while everyone else's needs become urgent. This is where the real burden begins. The danger is not that empaths feel deeply. The danger is that many never learn the difference between empathy and responsibility. Feeling another person's pain does not mean you are responsible for removing it. Understanding someone's suffering does not require sacrificing your own well-being. Yet countless empaths blur that boundary until they can no longer distinguish where another person's emotions end and their own begin. The philosopher Carl Jung once suggested that what we fail to acknowledge within ourselves does not disappear. It waits, it gathers strength in the unconscious. Every ignored disappointment, every swallowed frustration, every moment of silent resentment accumulates beneath the surface. An empath may appear calm for years while internally carrying a growing archive of emotional debt. The world often rewards this behavior. People praise the one who is always available. They admire the person who never complains. They celebrate selflessness without asking whether it has become self-erasure. The empath receives approval precisely because they ask for so little in return. But approval can become a trap when it depends on abandoning yourself. Eventually, something subtle begins to happen. Exhaustion replaces compassion. Listening feels heavier than it once did. Conversations that were once fulfilling begin to feel draining. The empath still smiles, still says yes, still shows up, but inside, there is an increasing sense of emptiness that no amount of gratitude from others can fill. What makes this particularly dangerous is that empaths are often disconnected from their own anger. They have been taught, directly or indirectly, that being good means staying agreeable. So instead of expressing frustration, they suppress it. Instead of setting boundaries, they rationalize harmful behavior. Instead of confronting disrespect, they excuse it because they understand where it came from. But understanding is not immunity. You can understand why someone hurts you and still be deeply wounded by their actions. You can recognize another person's trauma without making it your lifelong obligation to heal them. Compassion without boundaries is not wisdom. It is emotional depletion disguised as virtue. This is why the transformation that comes later often surprises everyone. It looks sudden from the outside, but it has been developing quietly for years. Every overlooked need, every broken promise, every emotional compromise has been adding another layer beneath the surface. The darkness people eventually notice is rarely born in a single moment. It is the echo of countless moments when the empath chose everyone else before themselves. The most dangerous thing an empath can lose is not they. Here's the expanded second key point, written to flow naturally from the previous segment and lead seamlessly into the final transformation. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, something changes. Not because the empath has stopped caring, but because the emotional cost of caring without limits has finally become greater than the fear of disappointing other people. This is the moment that so many misunderstand. Friends call it a personality change. Family members describe it as becoming cold. Those who benefited from the empath's endless availability often say, "You're not the person you used to be." They're right, but not in the way they think. What they are witnessing is not the birth of a darker person. They are witnessing the end of a version of someone who survived by constantly abandoning themselves. There is a profound psychological difference between becoming heartless and becoming unavailable for exploitation. Unfortunately, to those who have always expected unlimited access to your compassion, those two things can look exactly the same. Human relationships are built on patterns. We teach people how to relate to us through what we repeatedly tolerate, excuse, and reward. When an empath spends years absorbing criticism without responding, solving problems that are not theirs, or giving second, third, and 10th chances, those behaviors become the foundation of relationship. People adapt to that version of the empath. They come to expect it. Then one day, the pattern breaks. The empath says no without explaining. They stop chasing conversations that are clearly one-sided. They no longer rush to rescue people from consequences they created themselves. Messages are answered later. Invitations are declined without guilt. Silence replaces arguments that once consumed endless emotional energy. To the empath, these actions feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. To everyone else, they can feel shocking. This is where psychology offers an important insight. We often mistake consistency for authenticity. If someone has always behaved a certain way, we assume that behavior reflects who they truly are. But consistency can also reflect adaptation. Many empaths are not consistently self-sacrificing because it is their deepest nature. They are consistent because they learned that love, safety, or acceptance depended on being indispensable to others. Eventually, that strategy collapses under its own weight. There comes a moment when emotional exhaustion strips away performance. The empath begins asking questions they have avoided for years. Why am I the one who always understands? Why is my compassion expected but rarely reciprocated? Why do I feel guilty for protecting the same peace that everyone else protects without apology? These questions are unsettling because they challenge an identity that may have existed for decades. The empath realizes that they have confused being needed with being valued. Those are not the same thing. Someone can depend on your emotional labor while remaining remarkably indifferent to your emotional well-being. That realization changes everything. Notice that the shift is rarely explosive. It is usually quiet. The empath stops arguing because they no longer believe every misunderstanding deserves their energy. They stop explaining because they understand that people committed to misunderstanding them will always find another reason. They stop trying to convince others of their intentions because genuine respect does not require endless proof. From the outside, this restraint can appear intimidating. People who once interpreted constant availability as love now experience boundaries as rejection. They call the empath distant, guarded, or even cruel. But what they are actually confronting is something they have never had to face before. A person who has finally decided that their own emotional health matters too. There is another paradox here. The empath who never expressed anger often becomes more direct, not because they have become more hostile, but because honesty has replaced avoidance. They no longer soften every truth to protect someone else's comfort. They no longer confuse peacekeeping with peace. After years of suppressing discomfort to maintain harmony, they begin understanding that authentic relationships can survive difficult conversations, while unhealthy ones often cannot. This is why the transformation feels so dramatic. The external behavior changes quickly, but the internal process has been unfolding in silence for years. Every ignored boundary, every broken promise, every moment of emotional depletion has quietly prepared the ground for this decision. What appears to be a sudden withdrawal is, in reality, the accumulated weight of countless moments when the empath realized that giving everything still was not enough. And perhaps the most difficult lesson is this: not everyone will celebrate your healing. Some people only feel comfortable with the version of you that required less from them. When you begin protecting your time, your energy, and your emotional space, you reveal which relationships were built on mutual respect and which were built on unlimited access. The moment an empath begins choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice is often mistaken for darkness. In truth, it is the first unmistakable sign that they have finally remembered they belong to themselves. Once an empath reaches this point, there is a temptation to believe the journey is over. The boundaries have been set. The unhealthy relationships have been left behind. The exhaustion has finally been acknowledged. But in many ways, this is where the real work begins. Because there is a profound difference between protecting your peace and building walls around your heart. After years of emotional depletion, it is understandable to become skeptical. The mind begins searching for danger before it searches for connection. Every act of kindness is questioned. Every new relationship is measured against old disappointments. The nervous system, having learned through painful experience that openness can lead to exploitation, starts treating vulnerability as a threat rather than a bridge. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of healing. The very experiences that teach us to protect ourselves can also convince us never to trust again. If we are not careful, what began as healthy boundaries can slowly harden into emotional isolation. And isolation may feel safe, but safety without connection is not the same as fulfillment. This is where maturity asks something far more difficult than simply walking away. It asks us to integrate both compassion and discernment. It asks us to become people who can remain deeply caring without becoming endlessly available, to listen without absorbing, to love without rescuing, to give without disappearing. The psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the importance of integrating what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we fear, deny, or suppress. For many empaths, the shadow is not cruelty. It is strength. It is anger that was never allowed to speak. It is the ability to say no without guilt. It is the willingness to disappoint someone in order to remain honest with yourself. When these qualities remain buried, they do not vanish, they wait. And when they finally emerge after years of suppression, they often appear with overwhelming intensity. This is why some empaths describe feeling almost unfamiliar with themselves after they begin setting boundaries. They wonder whether they have become too cold or too detached. More often than not, they have simply met parts of themselves they were never encouraged to develop. A healthy empath is not someone who feels less. A healthy empath feels deeply while also thinking clearly. They recognize that compassion without wisdom can become self-destruction, and that generosity without limits often attracts people who mistake kindness for permission. They no longer measure love by how much they are willing to endure. Instead, they measure it by the presence of mutual respect, accountability, and emotional reciprocity. This changes every relationship. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person stay?" they begin asking, "Does this relationship allow both of us to grow?" Instead of asking, "What more can I give?" they begin asking, "What are we creating together?" The focus shifts from proving worth through sacrifice to building connection through honesty. Ironically, this version of the empath is often more compassionate than the one who came before, not because they give more, but because their giving is no longer driven by fear. It is driven by choice. There is immense freedom in knowing that your kindness is an expression of your character, not a requirement for your acceptance. People will still misunderstand this transformation. Some will continue to call it selfish because they benefited from your lack of boundaries. Others will accuse you of changing because your growth no longer serves their expectations. But growth has always required disappointing the version of you that existed solely to keep everyone else comfortable. The deepest relationships will not collapse because of your boundaries. They will become stronger. Healthy people do not fear your limits, they respect them. They understand that trust is not built by unlimited access, but by consistency, honesty, and mutual care. The relationships that survive your transformation are often the ones that finally allow you to experience something unfamiliar, being valued not for what you provide, but for who you are. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside what people mistakenly call an empath's darkness. The darkness was never the destination, it was the threshold. It was the difficult passage between a life defined by self, abandonment, and a life guided by self-respect. What appeared frightening was simply the moment you stopped betraying yourself to keep others comfortable. And maybe that is the question each of us must carry long after this conversation ends. Not whether we are kind enough, patient enough, or generous enough, but whether our compassion includes the one person who has been waiting for it all along, ourselves.